What is NFT? It's a description of how the world works.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. This is the job guarantee panel, finally. And I'm gonna give the word to Oliver before I introduce everyone. Oliver is with the European Trade Union Institute, and they are co-organizers of the panel.
Yeah. So the European Trade Union Institute is an institute in Brussels that supports the European trade unions. I've worked there for 6 months now, but I'll stay there for a longer time, and I hope to establish the idea of a job guarantee also within the European trade union movement a little bit more, and this is why we co-organized the panel. Before we start, however, I would like to give a short present to Dirk for this excellent conference organization.
So, we're going to start the panel with Giacomo, but before we start, this is Giacomo Bracci. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Trento. We have Fabio de Masi, who is with the Linke, German political party. We have Patricia Pino, who does the MMT podcast. We have Eduardo Garzon, who is the job guarantee champion in Spain, and he's currently professor at Madrid University. We have Rohan Gray, who most of you know, he's with the Modern Money Network. And we have Oliver, who just introduced himself. So Giacomo, could you start with telling us a little bit about the job guarantee for those of us who don't know about it and how it fits into the MMT policy approach?
Right, so thank you very much. As some of you or many of you may know, the job guarantee is the cornerstone of the MMT approach to macroeconomic policy, but also to labor market policy. If we imagine the currency when a gold standard was in place, what would the government do? The government would set the price of gold by administering the price of gold, and then somehow managing the quantity of gold in the economy in order to, let's say, achieve price stability. Now, we were talking about it yesterday. Among the many properties that gold has, price stability is not one of those, because it's a very volatile good, and also it's not a fundamental input of the production process. Instead, labor is the we may call it commodity, but I don't like it, but still is something that we can attach onto it, and wages are less volatile than gold. It's a fundamental input of the production process, and so it's the best candidate to any targeting policy for price stability. But apart from that, the job guarantee program allows to fully employ labor as in the same way in which gold was fully employed when the gold standard was in place. In the sense that with the job guarantee, the government offers a base wage to all those who are unemployed and willing to work and able to work, and then lets the quantity of workers float according to the stage of the business cycle. So when the business cycle is negative and unemployment would expand because businesses fire and households cut their spending plans, then the reserve army of the employed people within the job guarantee program would be bigger. Instead, when the economy restarts and when the business cycle gets positive, then the pool of workers within the job guarantee program would shrink. And this means that it's much like an automatic stabilizer, but it has the advantage that it targets specifically job creation. So it's not an indirect policy of demand management that somehow pushes aggregate demand to its maximum in order to somehow have jobs trickle down to the bottom of the income distribution ladder, but it directly targets job creation, and that job creation is the premise upon which growth is supposed to emerge. So it's a totally and radically different approach, both with respect to simple income support for the unemployed programs that have been tried throughout history wherever, and are the most common stabilization function that every economist usually thinks about. But also, it's not a traditional Keynesian policy, because it's not about boosting private investment and private profits to their maximum in order to hope that this would generate employment, but it's a direct job creation program. Much like the spirit of the New Deal program, but what MMT has to say about it is that this program is always financially affordable, provided that no restrictions on the monetary sovereignty are included. Let's say, for example, tying a currency to gold or tying a currency to another currency via a fixed exchange rate regime. So the job guarantee program allows the potential of a government to express at its maximum, because it always allows to have business cycle fluctuations not being somehow carried as a burden on workers. So it allows workers to somehow resist to business cycle fluctuations. But not only that, it also allows the government to choose which kind of growth we want to achieve. In these days we're always talking about the Green New Deal as a proposal that has been also discussed in this panel. And this is because with the job guarantee program you don't have to rely on the choice of capital intensity by the market, but the government can directly choose which kind of technology, which kind of production processes will be included in the program. So it's really a radical and a revolutionary approach to labor market policy and macroeconomic policy. As just a brief example, I can tell you something about the proposal I've worked with at the European Parliament, for the European Parliament, with FEF Academy, which is the think tank and society I've contributed to create with some of the colleagues that are here today. And this was an example of how we can design such a policy and think about several funding options. Now we know that in the euro area governments do not have any degree of freedom, or have less degree of freedom with respect to, let's say, sovereign governments. But what we have found studying a possible application of this program in Europe is that two things mostly. First of all, even with existing constraints, so even with existing fiscal policy constraints, job guarantee programs are the superior option the governments can have to stabilize the economy. Why is that? Well, two examples. First off, in all macroeconomic models used to estimate the fiscal space available to governments, even within the existing constraints, investment in workforce have the highest multiplier. So they allow you to somehow have a net cost of the program that is much, much less than income support programs. This is because somehow the push to GDP is direct through public expenditures. And the other important aspect of it is that the euro area, and Italy is actually the country that has this problem the most in the euro area, but the whole euro area has a problem with inactive workers and long-term unemployed that are no longer considered as unemployed by official statistics. Considering the increase in labor force participation that the job guarantee program could engineer, because if you think about it, when offering such a base wage to let's say, ideally we would say to everyone willing to work, but we can also, given the existing constraints, think about prioritizing those who are inactive and long-term unemployed. This would also push, according to existing criteria, potential growth upwards. And so, actually, if we consider all the instruments that are available to a government within the existing constraints, still the job guarantee is the superior option in terms of price stability, on fiscal space, on the opening of fiscal space, and also it's not a concern that one would have with a fully fledged monetary sovereign government, but given the existing constraints, it's also the best option we have for productivity side of the economy, because it directly engineers an increase in labor force participation. And these are the premises upon which we carried out this study, and we found out that actually, even in Italy, a job guarantee program would be financially affordable in the sense that it would not be, it would not generate an explosion of the deficit GDP ratio, because the push to GDP would be much higher, so what would you recoup from the investment would be much higher. Of course, without all of these constraints, everything becomes much easier and the program can be implemented up to its full potential. Of course, in Italy, the discussion about job guarantee is still not advanced that we would like, but this is something that is very common to all European countries. Still, we find an increasing interest in programs that are different from traditional welfare programs or traditional income support programs. And also, the issue is being increasingly discussed by Italian scholars, even those who are not, let's say, fully 100% MMT or whatever, but are still in the post-Keynesian, in the broadest post-Keynesian camp and in the Keynesian camp. And I think this addresses also another objection, another point of criticism they usually raised about Italian welfare programs, and this is my last point, which is corruption. Usually corruption is brought about as the number one obstacle to any government support program. Well, the advantage of the job guarantee is that being it universal, the opportunities for opportunistic behavior, corruption, and ex-ante selection of beneficiaries are much, much less. And it also means that people are directly brought to the job market, so it's not about convincing people to attend active labor market policies programs and hoping that they would find jobs through friendship or something. It's a direct contact with the job, and it's much, much more efficient in this sense. So these are some of the points I'd like to raise. Don't have much time, and I don't want to
Thank you, Giacomo.
Thanks.
It seems to me like this is a program that is attractive, should be attractive, not only to the left, but even to the right spectrum of the political side. So, Fabio, being a politician, maybe you can tell us a little bit of what you think about the job guarantee and what your views are.
Well, in my case, I'm from the left political spectrum. But good. First of all, I'm a trained economist, and I've been a member of the European Parliament in the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee. Now I'm in the Financial Affairs Committee of the German Parliament, which means nothing. So neither being an economist nor being a politician qualifies you for anything. At least not for economic debates, but I will do my best. And I was stunned to be invited to a job guarantee panel because I don't have any expertise in labor market policies, but I think that I understand a little bit about the whole MMT discourse and how it may link to this question. So first of all, I think that we live in very interesting times because we have currently a debate, for example, in the United States, about Green New Deal with Alexander Ocasio-Cortez and the 70% marginal tax rate, which I think is very intriguing because if you look at the economic problem of our times, we see an accumulation of wealth, we see an unequal wealth distribution, but a lack of public investment. So it's easy to reconcile both. For example, if you lobby for tax justice, you would tax wealth and fund it and gear investment towards economic needs, ecological change, a new energy system, which would also involve the employment of labor. However, if I understand MMT correctly, the argument is you don't need that. You don't need to tax the rich to fund these investments because you have the central bank. And I would agree to a certain extent. However, I would also say it may be still a clever idea to tax the rich to correct some social imbalances. And here is where MMT comes in, and if I still understand, if I remember correctly my economic studies, the basic argument of MMT was, and probably you're much more aware of it than myself, that a central bank could fund, for example, public investment. It would be, so to speak, a free lunch until you arrive at a point where, let's say, everybody's employed and inflation would come in. So inflation, in that view, is not an outcome, let's say, of printing too much money, chasing too few goods, but inflation, for example, in a post-Keynesian view, would be an outcome of a conflict. So if, for example, trade unions would be in a position to demand much higher wages beyond increase in productivity and the target inflation rate of the central bank. You might have cost push inflation at some point, but usually if you have unemployed people, that's not the case, because the trade unions would be very much too weak to even demand like very high wages. So the counter argument that you would usually find in the discussion in the European Parliament, and especially in the German Parliament, would be that, oh no, that's nothing you can do. Like if the central bank prints too much money, you will have skyrocketing inflation. So, but if you look at empirical evidence, and we look to Japan, for example, printed a lot of money, so to speak, or they bought bonds and so on the secondary market, you had no explosion of inflation. Certainly, however, you would have a problem, in my view, if and that's the problem of the current economy. You have already a job guarantee program, but you have a job guarantee program for investment bankers in very unproductive sectors of the financial economy right now, because some of the money that is being created is not going towards real investment. It's not going towards public investment, for example, to stimulate the real economy, but feeds into financial bubbles, exactly because we have the kind of austerity policies in Europe which hamper investment demand. And so I think it is a clever idea to employ parts of MMT proposals and to have central bank funded public investment programs. And if I also understand MMT correctly, you would only have a problem with government debt. Basically, government debt would be only an instrument to target the inflation rate. So if the economy would be full steam, then you would say, okay, now maybe we have to cool down a little bit on public investment. And I think that is basically a correct argument, in my view. The only issue here may be that certainly you have some international aspects, exchange rates and so on coming into play. So I would say that in theory it's a sound argument. However, you may have reactions to the exchange rate that you may want to consider. It makes a difference whether you're a large economic area, let's say the United States, whether you're Canada, whether you're the Eurozone, then you're relatively free to employ those policies. But if you are a small member state that maybe has to import a lot of goods, then this policy may not be feasible if it leads to the devaluation of your currency and drives up import prices. So I think that's a very important thing to be in mind. However, my party has always argued that we should directly finance public investment, even by the central bank. And it's very interesting, the counter arguments that were usually employed went like this. No, you cannot do that because, as I mentioned, inflation would explode. But what is very interesting is that there is no, like the economic policy establishment has apparently no problem with inflation on the financial markets. So if you see like driving up like property prices or like let's say if you see shares being pumped up on Wall Street or somewhere else, nobody has any problem with that. But if it comes to spending money into the real economy, everybody is like going crazy about inflation. So I think we have to look at both, first of all, and I think that in the current economic system, current way that monetary policy is utilized, we would basically allow a certain degree of inflation on the property markets, on the financial markets, but we would discriminate against inflation in the real economy. My second argument, the second argument employed against MMT policies would be usually, no, you cannot let bureaucrats or politicians decide where the money is spent. So my question would be, because markets are much better in resource allocation. So I would recommend to anybody who is convinced of that argument to hire a helicopter to fly across the coastal areas in Spain, because there you could see how well banks and market participants have employed resources during the last real estate bubble to like basically investments that later had to be written off. So my argument is that markets do not allocate better resources. So even that would be an argument in favor of job guarantee programs. And then there's a third argument, which is not purely economic. So a lot of, like pro-business lobbyist groups would argue that, the problem of unemployment is a skills mismatch. Yeah. So people are not anymore able to perform the jobs that we are seeking as enterprises. I don't think that this argument is completely absurd. I think there is some truth to it. If you leave people for a long time in unemployment and like they have to sit at home and stay at the wall, certainly a lot of there's a lot of dequalification going on because people lose their skills, they become depressed, and so you would observe what in economic terms you would also call a hysteresis. So it's not anymore as easy to catch up in the labor market. And this is a strong argument in favor of a job guarantee program, because thereby you would limit that problem that people are without employment. And there's also a discourse in that field of labor market policies about something like a basic income grant. I just want to make the point, I'm more skeptical about that proposal because I think it would merely lead to the public sector subsidizing wages of the private sector, and business might be inclined to lower wages. But I'm in favor of creating employment opportunities also because I think that having an employment opportunity is more than having an income. It's also about participating in the social life of a society. And I think, me as a leftist, it has always been, like our mission to humanize the world of work, but not to say we need to abandon it, like completely, and then we have a basic income grant and everything is fine. We had to fight for shorter working hours, for more control of the economic life, democratic control of the economic life, of investment decisions, such as with investment, like public control over resource allocation, of investment decisions. But it was never our mission to say, let's just have a basic income grant and then it's fine. It's a little bit the same as, a proposal that has been also sponsored by many neoliberal economists, because they said capitalism brings about basically unemployment, and we have to pacify the reserve army of labor by just giving them a paycheck, and then everything is fine, we don't have to deal with them anymore. That is at least not my proposal. I think that's my last comment, ecological change, steering our economy away from the current model it has, which is destroying our environment, provides ample opportunities for investment, ample opportunities for work for the world of labor, but we have to be ready and to be prepared to intervene in the economy, and this is what MMT is also about, and this is why I think it is a very challenging and interesting proposal for the economic debates. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Patricia. I have a podcast called the MMT Podcast in the UK. I'm not an economist, but I am with many other activists in the UK that was quite angry to find out that austerity was completely gratuitous and pointless, especially in a country like the UK, who are not constricted like Eurozone countries are. So it made me so angry that it made me even more angry that I was forced to study economics because the economists were not doing it properly. But my aim, I work mainly within the Labour Party. The Labour Party is a socialist democratic party. I don't know if many of you know, but recently our party has become more democratic. We've elected Jeremy Corbyn a couple of years back, and that was with its ups and downs, and it was a huge battle within the party. But I think it's fair to say that the left, the Socialists and the Labour Party at the moment are in firm control of the party and in the process of democratising the party. So it's a party that is luckily run from the bottom up, which is not common for many parties across Europe at the moment, which means that the people that we need to persuade of policies like the job guarantee and the Green New Deal are actually twofold. You need the membership to come with you because they need to be able to vote and approve the manifesto of the party, but at the same time you need the economist advisors at the top of the party to actually agree to consider this proposal. And there are challenges in both sides, and they are very different. I've focused mostly on trying to identify, so I think it's important to say that my economic background is firmly middle class, but when I joined Labour, obviously most of the party is working class, and it takes, I made a point to try to understand specifically their concerns and their relationship to work, which I think is very different to the middle class relationship to work. The middle class has more autonomy, is generally more content to work, they see opportunities in a job guarantee because to them it means freedom. To the working class is quite the opposite. They have been immensely exploited over the last few decades, especially the last 10 years in the UK, where the Tory government has put the Department of Work and Pensions, which is basically a department of enforced work, and grab people who were ill, whose GP would say they could not work, and they said, no, you need to do a test, and put them with an unqualified administrative officer who would then decide that you're fit for work and you're not eligible for benefits. So the last 10 years, it's fair to say, has been quite traumatizing for the working class, and many people within the Labour Party come from this background, have been, at the receiving end of the brunt of austerity in the UK and all the cruelty that comes with it. So how do you then offer a job guarantee to people who are quite traumatized by the concept of work? That's the challenge, and especially when you talk about, the economic arguments are lost on them because these are very much creative people, and they have a lot of imagination, but they are not so technical. They're not professionals necessarily. And whilst a lot of MMTs are, I'm generalizing, but a lot of MMTs that I've met are engineers and come from technical backgrounds in general. So we need another way to communicate with them, and there is a gap, I think, in communicating with people with no technical background whatsoever, who are ultimately the people that will benefit the most from a job guarantee. And we need to reach the groups of individuals. I focus on women because they are one of the biggest beneficiaries of the job guarantee. So that's kind of the aim of the MMT podcast, was to create a kind of a colloquial and a kind of light-hearted talk about economics within the context of the UK, trying to explain it to ordinary people, to say, look, what the politicians said yesterday, that's complete rubbish because of this. And try and give activists within the Labour Party the weapons to make their own cases for whatever cause they're interested in. The challenges at the moment in the UK, is about how to sell the job guarantee from a perspective not of a minimum wage so much, but of improvement of quality of work. Because I think the job guarantee doesn't just set a floor for wages; it sets a floor for the quality of work that we offer, and in its best form, it can provide very engaging, very fulfilling work, and can reinvigorate a lot of communities in the UK that have been forgotten. The other challenge, I don't know if you've heard of this thing called Brexit, that so we're a little bit distracted by that, to say the least, in the UK, and it's occupying so much political space as there is barely any room to discuss these things. Austerity is still present and still doing its worst, but it's taken a back step in the face of Brexit. But, times of uncertainty are also times of opportunity. And there is a growing contingency of pro-Brexit or Lexiters, left-wingers or socialists who have felt empowered by MMT because obviously the mainstream or the liberal kind of pro-Europe, pro-EU economists and most of the establishment have, for example, sold this idea that after after Brexit, the UK will have, cannot balance its budget, therefore austerity will have to continue. So Lexiters can use MMT to counter those arguments quite easily, even though nobody's saying that there are no economic challenges. But at the same time, it's an opportunity to spread the message about the job guarantee and why the job guarantee is superior to a UBI. And I strongly believe it is for the reasons that you said, but also because I think that if you're a socialist, you learn a lot about relationship of capital and labour, and it's something that most socialists within the Labour Party are quite familiar with. And I think that the job guarantee offers a much more challenge to the power of capital than the UBI does. So I'm trying to sell it on that point as well. The other opportunity is obviously what's going on in the US. And
sorry, we have Rohan who's going to talk about the US.
Yeah, no, I'm not gonna step on his feet. So. He does it better than me anyway. But I'm just going to say that the UK does feel under pressure about what's happening there, and we used to be the most progressive party in promising left-wing party in the West, and now we're feeling a little bit outflanked, and the economists who are close to the leadership, unfortunately, they're still working to an ETUI model, which I just found out recently, and it's very heartbreaking. So they are not very receptive yet to the idea of a job guarantee, but the pressure from the US is making them think again, especially because a lot of people in the UK like the Green New Deal. And I think that what they're going to try and do is try to dislodge the Green New Deal from a job guarantee. And I think the next step for us in the UK is to make sure that we sell it as a package and make sure that we insist that one is needed for the other. That's it for me.
So Eduardo is going to give us a little insight into what's going on in Spain.
Thank you, Skender. Hi, everybody. I'm from Spain, and I'm also member of Unite Left, Izquierda Unida, that include the Communist Party. And when I met MMT and Job Guarantee, that was in 2014, I realized that it was a great opportunity to include in our electoral program, because my brother is and he was the leader of the Unite Left. I tried to convince him, and I achieved that. So,
Antonio.
he was agreed with me, and we start to studying how job guarantee could be implemented in Spain, looking for the economic area and the legislation, legislative area. No? And we did a lot of work, and we put in a book in 2015, and we had a good news, no? Because we realized that the job guarantee is perfectly compatible with the current legislation in Spain. So we had not the necessity to create another jurisdictional law or framework, so just making a small adjustment in our legislation, we could perfectly implement a job guarantee. Our problem, as you can imagine, is that in Spain in 2015 we had a 25% of unemployment rate. We are talking about more than 5 million unemployed. So people, when heard us about the fall unemployment, people thought that it's a naive thing and something utopian. No? But we were a great effort explaining all of the people in our country. We spent a lot of time traveling around the cities, I could say, without exaggerating, that I visited more than 100 cities with a not great audience, as you can imagine, but I'm talking about between 100 and 300, so it's not small at all. No? And we went also to the TV program, prime TV program, with more than 1 million of audience. But the problem there is we had no time to explain, and we also say we have a proposal to achieve the following plan, and the long time and the short time we can achieve 1 million people employed with 1,000 euro monthly wage, and explaining how we can implement that, etc., etc. But I don't know if you know the electoral map in Spain for that year, but Podemos was increasing their power, and we are really in a very small area because we didn't join at that time, 2015. Okay, and Podemos prefer the universal basic income for that time. We had a lot of problem because people clearly identified that contrary proposal. But I have to say, some of people also from Podemos like the job guarantee, and the other one and the contrary as well. And when we were in a TV program, people always say the same: how you can achieve a full employment with more than 5 million people, and how can you pay that proposal? Because in Spain we have, of course, no sovereignty in money and monetary control, and we also have a 8 point over GDP, lower than the average European average in terms of financial and fiscal position. So we had a lot of problems to explain that measure, but also the people thought that we were achieve a really bad result in the election in 2015. We don't, because finally we get more than 1 million of votes without Catalonia and Galicia. There are two big regions, and after that Podemos say we cannot win that United Left, so we had to join it. And that is because in the 2016 we were together finally, but the problem was they didn't like at all the job guarantee, so they asked really hardly quit to the program. And we also did the same with the basic income university. So the final result was we are now in a special position because we support the actual government. It's socialist government, but they need our support, but we cannot explain or talk about job guarantee, neither basic universal income. And we have another problem also, that is in Spain we are weaker than 2015, in part because the people are not talking about poverty or the unemployment or precarity, but they are talking about the independence of Catalonia, the nationalist thing, and we are outside and we cannot put in the agenda again the job guarantee. And also the strength right is gaining power, so this is not our best situation. But the good news is people in Spain, mainly from the left side, knows perfectly what is the job guarantee. That is a big step because perhaps in a short time maybe we can regain that space and use that people that knows the job guarantees and you can implement it and the benefits could be achieved.
Thank you very much. So, Rohan, please tell us a little bit about what's going on in the U.S. and what's going on with the job guarantee and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah, I'm going to start with a little bit of history because I think it's important to know how we got to the moment that we're in the US in order to understand its relevance and understand the trajectory and why. So I'll start sort of a little bit at the beginning, which is with the start of MMT. So Warren Mosler was a financier with years and years of experience in the markets. He came to a group of economists through an online listserv, one of the first online academic listservs that ever existed. This was a global space where someone from Australia, someone from different parts of the United States, people living in Europe at the time could talk to each other and discuss these ideas. And what came out of that was that these group of people started to see things the same way. They realized that even amongst this heterodox group, they saw something different from everybody else. They were also very ambitious and synthetic. They brought in the fact that this sort of financial market understanding was as important as being a trained economist, if not more. And they brought in an awareness that in order to do this, they were going to have to go beyond academia and beyond the economics departments that had held back the development of heterodox economics. So Bill Mitchell started the first blog for MMT, I think back in 2004. And it was one of the first ways to take this outside of the academy and go directly to the public. And when the 2008 crisis happened, it was a moment where suddenly people were hungry for new ideas, and MMT had done the heavy lifting of doing that work and preparing it. When you build it, they come eventually. And in this case, that was the catalyst. So going public, going global, going digital was the precondition. The crisis was the catalyst. And then from there, you had people who were hungry for something different. Left intellectuals, others around the world looking for narratives to explain what they couldn't explain with their existing understanding, came to these online MMT ideas. And you know, if you were there at the time, there was a battle of different ideas. The Economist wrote an article, I think in 2011, that was one of the first times that MMT was mentioned in a mainstream academic publication, and it was alongside the market monetarists and the Austrians. You remember those people? I forgot they existed, but at the time, it was a battle of the soul of this next vision of economics, of who would be the one providing the sort of next vision after the failure of orthodox economics. And MMT, it seems like, at least on the left, has won that fight. Part of that work was just the people who'd been doing the work steadily for years and years in the background, not asking for credit, people growing slowly, talking to individuals, teaching people, painstakingly responding to every email. But part of it was also very selective and strategic relationship building, reaching out to people in the media, people in the financial markets, leveraging the expertise and credibility of different people against each other. You think we're crazy? Actually, these people tell us we're serious, and you think they're serious. What do you think about that? Thinking very strategically about what it means to adopt a big new paradigm at a time when people don't fully understand what you're offering, but they're hungry for something. When I came across it as an Australian, studied a little bit of political economy, and by the way, as an Australian, it's a pleasure to be here. I have English and German background, so it's lovely to be at this conference, and thank you for entertaining a non-European. I'm sure you're getting sick of being told what to do in Europe by non-Europeans, but bear with me. Anyway, I instantly saw this had relevance to law schools and to the legal academy, but that lawyers had not really considered macroeconomics for decades, if not longer. If you search for law and macroeconomics at the time in the American Legal Academy, there are about 3 articles that have been written in the last 25 years. That's no longer the case. And if you look for legal scholarship on money, you couldn't find a place to start. That's also no longer the case. So we started aggressively using the fact that we were at Ivy League law schools that had a high amount of social capital to legitimize these ideas in the other power discipline next to economics, and then to bring that back into the MMT space, while also deepening those ideas in ways that brought in different perspectives. So people like Matthew Forstater from the start had talked about the racial justice implications of MMT, the environmental implications of MMT, the radical anarchist implications of MMT even. And those kinds of sort of ecumenical, multi-dimensional approach to this set of ideas, that it has relevance to people beyond just macroeconomists and monetary economists, was what gave it a base of support even when the economics department remained hostile. So from there, people started to come across this who were also radical organisers, grassroots organisers. A colleague of mine, Jesse Meyerson, came across some of the events that we organised at Columbia, went down a rabbit hole and watched all of these videos and things, and came out of the other side going, I need to incorporate this into my activism. He put on a conference in 2015 called Grasping at the Root, that Stephanie Kelton was at with myself. I actually had the opportunity to be the person making the green case for a job guarantee because Matthew Forstater couldn't make it, which in hindsight was a really cool moment, because the people in the audience included the people who later founded the Sunrise Movement, which was the group that has launched the Green New Deal in the US. And I don't know whether they were considering a job guarantee before that conference, but that was a conference where we explicitly said there's going to need to be a new agenda, this is what it should look like, and here are the pay-for questions. And a lot of those organisers at the time were hesitant, they were sceptical. This was different, they knew Marx, but they didn't really know this stuff. Why should we trust these people? What, they're talking to financial markets and bankers? Are these Wall Street plants? What the hell are they doing at a progressive radical organising conference? And then a couple of years went by and things started to come out, and they started to see, okay, this guy called Bernie Sanders, he's made a huge splash at the national stage. His chief economic advisor was one of the people at that conference. Oh, maybe there's a there. Maybe this really does have the progressive cred that we thought it might. And of course, Stephanie has done an amazing job just with force of her personality and her painstaking effort to make this acceptable and non-scary enough to certain people that it was able to find a foothold in the DC power circuit and get past the point where it's completely nuts, to the point where people say, well, I disagree, but it's a valid idea, it deserves to be part of the conversation. It's one of the competing schools of thought for the sort of soul of the Democratic Party or the soul of the left in the US. And then Trump happened, of course, as I'm sure you're all unfortunately also aware, and blew up the playbook of what's realistic, of what's possible, of how things have to be done, which was the major, imaginative block up until that time. Everyone's saying, well, this is all great, but you don't understand how politics works. You don't understand what kind of compromises have to be made to win in this game. The playbook was completely thrown out the window, and the people who were presumed to be the most realistic were actually revealed to be the least realistic. Suddenly, there was a space in that power vacuum for people to build something new, and they were energized by the Bernie movement and, of course, things like Occupy and earlier. But that was really the catalyst moment where, we thought that was the darkest moment, and it looks like now there's actually a dawn potentially on the horizon. People like the Justice Democrats started recruiting people specifically to be unapologetically progressive, unbored, and to not play the electoral game the same way. Bernie created a whole set of infrastructure that exists to this day to start bringing together various parts of the left and parts of the progressive movement outside of the traditional Democratic Party base. And we kept doing our thing. We kept collecting all of the young intellectuals, trying to bring together the lawyers, different academic departments. We at my organization founded a humanities division. We organized our first conference last year called Money on the Left. Sorry, that's the second one. The first one was called Money and Aesthetics a couple of years earlier. Where we've had artists, we've had philosophers, we've had historians, things like that. And out of that, one of the conferences that we helped organize in New York City was one in collaboration with other job guarantee advocates from different traditions. The racial justice tradition carrying on the legacy of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, people carrying on the New Deal tradition of FDR, and this conference was on an economic bill of rights for the 21st century. And of course, we think there's something extra special about the MMT approach to a job guarantee that differentiates them or gives it the teeth necessary to finally defeat the forces that have always been in the way of job guarantee or a full employment vision, notably the central bankers and the inflation hawks who say this kind of thing will destroy any sense of equilibrium in the economy or give too much power to labour, etc. But at that conference that we organised at the New School in October of 2017, a colleague of mine who's now the outreach director of my organisation, Andres Bernal, who is a PhD student at the New School in the Urban and Public Affairs Department, who came across MMT through some of these online writings, like we all did, told his friend, who worked with him at the National Hispanic Institute, who was also selected as a young Latina with promise, who could, potentially run for office one day and represent her community's interests, that she should come along and check this stuff out because he'd been reading it for a while and he thought it was pretty visionary. And her name was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So she came to this conference, she sat in the back, she didn't talk to anybody, she just listened, and then a few days later the job guarantee was on her policy platform. That was happening at the same time that these Justice Democrats and others were starting to talk to Stephanie through the Bernie connection, starting to talk to these other people through the connections we'd made with the financial journalist community, the left literary community in New York and other places, and of course just the growing media awareness that MMT exists. So then Alexandria put the job guarantee on her platform. She won. Scared the entire Democratic establishment by taking a big scalp along the way and by having a better media game than all of them have managed to put together. And then when she got into power, the Sunrise Movement reached out to us and said, we want to develop a strategy for the Green New Deal that incorporates a job guarantee because we think that there's a space within the green movement. We're a very small group at that point, mostly young, mostly student driven. We're not the Sierra Club, we're not 350.org, we're not these kind of big established green non-profit industrial complex, but we think that there's a space that they haven't filled for a kind of green-blue labour alliance. And one of the things that kills the green movement is, first of all, it'll take jobs, it'll kill jobs. That's the classic right-wing narrative. And even on the left, the idea of degrowth, of we should all just sort of go back to, farms and huts and things is a sort of demoralizing narrative to many on the left. It's not forward-thinking. It has a feeling of being sentimental or kind of rose-tinted about a past that for many people wasn't as happy as it may have sounded. So this idea that we're going to lean in to a transition and we're going to do it in a way that makes sure that the most vulnerable communities and the most vulnerable workers are protected and actually put at the forefront of this transformation was something they thought was new. And then, of course, when they did their protests down in DC in November at the end of last year, and Alexandria not only supported them, but literally showed up, it's a different kind of politician than we've seen in the US for a long time, everybody's minds exploded, and since then it's just been a kind of roller coaster. So where we're at now is Alexandria did an interview on 60 Minutes where she said that MMT, where she was described as a proponent of MMT and said it absolutely needs to be part of the conversation. We have worked directly with members of her team, advising them. She has had multiple conversations with people in my organization, Stephanie, Pavlina, and others. And one of the challenges is to make sure that we keep the space fertile. We keep doing the heavy lifting so that she can give comments like that without getting her head taken down or without being laughed out of the room. If she had tried to do that 8 years earlier, it wouldn't have worked because you don't get a chance to explain macroeconomics and central banking operations in a 60 Minutes interview designed to be watched by millions of people. That has to be done in other contexts. The heavy lifting and the groundwork has to be there before the politician can move. And that is, it feels almost serendipitous confluence of all these different energies coming together in the right way at the right time. But where we're at now is that Sunrise Movement, which is the face of the activism on the ground, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's the face of this in Congress, along potentially with Bernie Sanders, who Stephanie is still very close with, are putting a job guarantee central to that commitment. When they ask people, do you support a Green New Deal, whether it's Cory Booker or Kamala Harris or Kristen Gillibrand, and they say, yeah, I think it's a good idea, they say, well, do you support a job guarantee? Because for us, that is fundamental to a Green New Deal. So they are not letting these people waffle and twist it and remain safe in ambiguity. They are forcing the policy framework to be part of the narrative at the activist level, and it's working in my opinion. The other thing that we're seeing is that there is a dialogue on questions like how do you pay for it. So the other group...
Sorry.
Okay, yep, sorry. Okay, cool, that's cool.
Thank you. Now we have...
Open a couple windows again for a few minutes?
Yeah, you can stand up and open the windows. Oliver, could you please tell us about your experience with the job guarantee and what the situation is in Austria?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about Austria, a bit about Germany, and how to maybe get public support for job guarantee programs and how to get them adopted. So Austria has a tradition of active labor market policy, and recently that was kind of like topped up by a program that was called the Action 20,000, which was a program that had an employment goal. Right, the goal was every person who is long-term unemployed, meaning you're unemployed for more than a year, and is over 50, because these people are usually, once you're over 50 and you become unemployed, your chances of getting a job are extremely slim, right? You'll for most of them that means they'll never get back into the labor market, and they'll remain unemployed for a very, very long time. So the Social Democrats in Austria managed to negotiate this program where they wanted to halve the unemployment rate of those people. And that meant going from around 50,000 people that are over 50 and long-term unemployed to about 20,000. And so the point of that program was to create 20,000 jobs, publicly funded, right? So the money comes from the central government, and the jobs are created locally. They're created, so essentially they were asking the mayors of small towns, okay, where is it where you could find, like, where you could use a person, like, do you need somebody with the local football club to mow the lawn or wash the dresses or something, right? There was also a program that a part of that was an action called live at home for a longer time, right? So for elderly people that essentially are not that old or that sick that they have to move to a retirement home, but they need some support at home, right? And they need like somebody who comes there every day and checks on them, or talks a little bit to them, or goes shopping with them, right? Because they need some help. And so these were the kind of jobs that were created. And we started the program was started in 2017 in July, and the pilot phase until the end of 2017 was extremely successful. More jobs were created than anticipated, and in the end, a few months after the pilot phase, we had 4,000 people in these jobs. So the program was extremely successful. There was in the labor market district that had the most encouraging staff of the labor market agency that was pushing it the hardest. Was a small district in Styria, which is the state of Austria, and they managed to reduce long-term unemployment of the over 50-year-olds by 56%. Right, so that's a huge for just a few months. That was a huge success. And unfortunately, then we had an election, and the election was all about migration and not about employment programs, which and as a result we have one of the most right-wing governments now. And the first action actually the first one a few days after the election was to stop that program, right? Because they knew the pilot phase was going to end and it would be expanded to those 20,000 jobs, and it would be only credited to the Social Democrats. And these programs, like basically support for long-term unemployed, and especially for elderly long-term unemployed, is hugely popular. I mean, opinion polls say it's like 80% of the electorate approves of these policies. And I think there is a more general point to be made, even though the program, has stopped, will run out after July of this year, because it was a 2-year program. I think there's a more general point that can be learned from this, especially also when we look at Germany, because there you have a program for the long-term unemployed now, and they will create 150,000 jobs for for all of Germany. And there are more and more members of political parties that speak out for these kind of programs, as I mean Fabio did, fortunately. And but there's also, for example, here in Berlin, the mayor of Berlin, Michael Müller, has spoken out for a much wider public employment program for the long-term unemployed. He wants to supersede these 150,000 jobs, and he estimates there's around 50,000 people that are long-term unemployed in Berlin, and he wants to basically give them all a job, right? He's even talking about a right to a job, right? So these are, and I think there's two ways to think about this, right? Like I think there's some of the, say, more dogmatic people, MMTers would say, well, this is not MMT, right? This is not a universal job guarantee. These are just like active labor market programs or public employment programs. They're limited. They're only for the long-term unemployed. But I think these programs are an important step because often the vision that, or the people that advise the politicians, right? They have kind of, they've read something about the employer of last resort, or they've read something about MMT, and they're just trying to do these programs in terms of what is politically achievable at first. And I think this is a huge opportunity for us to support them and to explain to the public that this is what we need, because once you show the public sector can administer such a huge program for long-term unemployed people, that's the first step to point to, well, okay, here's it for unemployed people who have been unemployed for more than a year, but let's expand it, let's do it for all age groups, let's do it for all unemployed people. So I think that's there's a general point here where we should try to get in touch with these program managers, with politicians that are introducing these programs, ally with them, and to argue for bigger programs on the European level, because usually, I mean, this is how social adoption works. I mean, I read an article about the introduction, the legalization of cannabis in the US, right? And so what happened was Colorado did it in like 20 years ago, and then nothing happened, right? And then suddenly, like another state, Washington, did it, and then suddenly, like more and more states in the US adopted this policy, and now it's kind of like the general policy that everybody wants to do, well, right? And so, like we need some states that are capable of doing it, that are in the European Union. Those would be the financially stronger states, right? Germany, Austria, Netherlands. We need these states to go forward with limited, or like, I mean, obviously as generous as possible, but limited programs to show that we can point to and say, here, they are successful, let's establish them for the whole Eurozone or the whole European Union. Yeah, thank you.
So I think we open up for questions, or there's not much time left for discussion.
Can you perhaps say who you want to address? So introduce yourself and also address, say who you want to address the question to.
Stuart.
I'm Stuart Medina, and my question is for Patricia. I've noticed the people like Joe Mitchell, Simon Wren-Lewis, and Peter Four, maybe not so much. Francis Coppola, etc. With, I would say, attacks which are increasingly vicious, right, against MMT or misrepresenting MMT. And I wonder what you make out of it. I mean, if you think that is a positive development, is it that they feel threatened and they see that their hold on the doctrine is waning? How do you?
I think we're well past the ignore stage,
yeah.
into the attack stage.
Shall I read it?
I think it's a shame that they have to react like that. I mean, it was from the start a very visceral reaction to MMT, but there are also other issues at play. Mm-hmm. I think the fact that MMT is quite popular amongst Lexiters, for example, plays a part because most of them are very pro-EU. So, those political things come. So there are political interests not to accept MMT from the onset. There are also personal interests, I'm sure, not to accept MMT. But I'm of the idea that we don't need them. What we need is to focus on the next generation of people to first of all educate the membership, who are the ones that hold the balance of power in the party, and the future generation of politicians that come in, but also to develop, working alongside the academics to try and have some more, to train some academics from the bottom up, I think, in the UK.
Hi, my name is Asger, and I'm from Denmark. We have strong unions. We don't have a minimum wage because the unions take care of it, and that's good. But I worked at the Danish Parliament for the Social Democratic Party last year, and I made this pitch about the job guarantee to get the last part of the unemployed involved in the labor market, and the response was this: "That's great ambition. We like the idea, but we won't get support from the unions because they will feel threatened that these whatever activities they'll be doing, their argument will be that they should pay our members to do it, or it's the proof of that there's some activity that our members should be employed to do. They shouldn't be on the job guarantee. They should be paid like the rest of our members." So I'm asking you if you have any either ideas or perhaps even experience with how to use the job guarantee in a way to empower unionizations and use it as to leverage unions to become stronger and get more members. I don't know, but this seems to me to be an obstacle perhaps in the country where it's most likely to be adopted first.
So I will refer the question to Oliver, who has worked in that area with the European Trade Union Institute.
Yeah, okay. I mean, maybe the Austrian experience is interesting there because traditionally the Minister of Social Affairs and Labor is, if the Social Democrats are in the government, is always a trade unionist, right? So, and what was important to the trade unions is that this program is not a minimum wage program where you pay like, I don't know, 10 euros an hour or 9 euros an hour or something, right? But instead that the jobs in this program are paid according to the collective bargaining agreements. Now typically that doesn't mean that it's a very high wage, right? Because these people, 2/3 of the long-term unemployed do not have a high school degree, right? So they will not qualify for highly paid jobs typically, right? And also there's a special collective bargaining agreement also for a lot of these jobs that is also not, it doesn't have an extremely high job, but it's not extremely high pay, but it's not the minimum wage job of like 1,500 euros per month or so. So they can, if they have experience and some of their experience is taken into account for these jobs, then they will earn maybe 2,000 euros or like we had some initial data about for the very first and a half months after the program started, so it was not a lot of observations, but the average salary was 1,928 euros 14 times per year, right? So it's not so bad. It's not great, but it's not minimum wage, and that was really important to the unions. And I don't think they would have wanted this program to go ahead if you had not made that concession. Yeah.
If I just one quick thing, there's not been much support in the US at the peak body union level for a lot of these things, even in a country that is used to putting human rights as a framework for pushing progressive policies. And I think that's partially because it seems like it's an encroachment on their turf. At the same time, I think, and I've said this to other MMTs, I'm not speaking on behalf of the MMT leadership, but I think there's an important conversation to be had about the relationship between the model of a fixed base wage and some sort of additional premium based on skills and experience consistent with the way that unions think of that. And I think that's not inherently inconsistent with the price stabilizing function that the minimum wage concept or the base wage concept of a job guarantee is supposed to protect. And I'm not interested in sort of saying, well, I'm here to do a different thing than all the other MTs, but I think it's a critical point of distinction between the job guarantee advocates in the US who come from the union movement and come from the FDR tradition and the MMT job guarantee advocates, and it's still a sticking point even after 20 years. So I hope our generation can address it together, but that's, it's real.
My question is probably mostly for Oliver and the gentleman from Australia. regarding, so I'm not really familiar with the concept. Also wasn't in the session yesterday. So I would be interested in more of the specifics, like what kind of jobs would these people do, or what kind of jobs did the people do in Austria where you had it, and how do you deal with regional disparities? If I think about the U.S., you know, you have unemployment strong. Let's take West Virginia, right? And if you give now a job guarantee, is it you know, would the people stay there and just do whatever type of jobs, or would they actually, if there's some sort of relocation scheme to the places where you need the workers and more? And lastly, maybe that also pertaining to the original New Deal, or generally, I mean, this is probably, for me as a macroeconomist, this would be, you know, very, very, especially relevant in a downswing in a recession. And couldn't you address it then through basically public investment programs where you automatically get people employed, you know, which basically happened in the US under Roosevelt, of course. So yeah, if you could comment on that, that'd be appreciated.
I'll answer a part of it on the what kind of jobs. So the jobs were very diverse. So all kinds of jobs. I mean, you had a few really qualified people, like with a degree in history or something, and they would be hired by the local museum to do research on something that they'd never had the money to do for, right? But most people, yeah, I mean, I tried to lay out some jobs in my talk. It's really very diverse, and there's a I think the tendency that we've observed, at least for Austria, I'm not sure if it would be the same in other countries, is that with the type of program that we had, where you kind of like get local information, right? You get the local labor market authority to talk with the local mayors, to ask them, okay, where do you need jobs, or to talk with local NGOs, like what do you need? Could you need somebody? What kind of job, right? Then it was easier for the labor market authorities on the countryside to come up with these jobs than it is in the large cities, because most long-term unemployed in Austria is concentrated in large cities, especially in Vienna. And unfortunately, because the program stopped after the pilot phase, we did not observe, I mean, there were 800 jobs created in Vienna, but if you have several thousand unemployed people, long-term unemployed people in Vienna, then we would have needed to wait for the program expansion to see how it goes in an urban environment where you maybe don't need that many people to support the local football club, or like where the mayor can say I need this and this, right? So and I think this approach goes a certain length, and then after that, as you say, right, you need to think about more coordinated, more programs at the federal level, with a specific aim, like public infrastructure investment and so on, to employ the rest of the people, right? So because I think this approach of finding somebody locally and employing them probably only goes a certain way, and then after that you need to have more, like New Deal programs or something like that. Right?
Fabio, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, just a very quick point. I think what is important in the whole MMT discussion, by the way, I don't know who invents these words, but words can destroy political ideas completely. So we also have to be careful about how we design our terms. I was just thinking about that because in Berlin we had a public ÖBS, öffentlicher Beschäftigungssektor, which translates, you know how...
Public employment.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds already awkward in German, but also in English. So this can destroy an idea. But what I wanted to say is we should not remain on the technical level. So for me, MMT doesn't mean that you tell Mario Draghi, you know, he should fight unemployment, everything is fine because he's a cool guy. You know, like you also need to democratize central banking. So you cannot simply argue, like you don't want to leave the economy to Wall Street bankers, you also don't want to leave it to Mario Draghi. So certainly if you want to do informed investment decisions in the central bank, for example, to target unemployment in a certain area, which you can perfectly do, it's not just a technical exercise. You need democratic control of our economy. But what I wanted to say is that I think MMT opens the space also for something which is very important, which addresses your question, that you have to, in the euro area, for example, you have a very diverse economy. So you may have full steam real estate bubble in one country and another development in another country. And so MMT opens the space also for credit guidance policies. So to steer investment into certain areas. And that's important. That's what the Japanese did after the Second World War, by the way. It's a very bad example, I know, but that's what the Germans did to fund their whole warfare fascist period. They guided preferential loans to certain sectors. And I think this is a very important thing to do. And also to concerning the Danish question, by the way, in Germany we introduced a minimum wage because our trade unions had been destroyed. And so there's a perfect argument why you don't want to have minimum wage, you want to have strong trade unions. But I think what is very important when it comes to this ÖBS program, which I mentioned in Berlin, there were some fears of trade unions that if you create public job guarantees, but for, let's say, at very low level, minimum wage, you would certainly undercut wages in the public sector and maybe provide an incentive for public administration to outsource higher paying jobs to this job guarantee program. That is exactly something that you don't want to have. So I think it's very important that you signal to the trade unions you want collective wage bargaining agreements to set the lower bounds for the wage.
In terms of the investment question, first of all, no form of indirect public investment captures the people at the very bottom. So yes, you can have forms of public investment that are counter-cyclical and mean that the amount of people who might be in the job guarantee program is smaller and smaller, but you need a job guarantee, otherwise there's always going to be at least one body in the unemployment queue at some point who's not getting the justice they deserve. So that's the first thing. I don't think that they're substitutes for each other, they're complementary. On the question of what kinds of jobs, we also need to drastically reimagine what we consider to be useful remunerative work. There's a huge amount of unpaid care work, a huge amount of unpaid household work right now done by groups of people, usually women, who are not getting remunerated, and this is a way to bring that kind of work in even as we sunset other kinds of work that are not, environmentally friendly, etc. And so I think we need to think about transforming the notion of work even as we think about creating more jobs. And then on the question of relocation, I think one of the big challenges here is to think about spatial justice and the way that this affects spatial justice. There's a reason there's a brain drain from many countries or from many regions, from smaller countries to big countries or from the towns to the cities, and it's usually to do with the availability of economic opportunity. Now, we don't need to keep people isolated in small communities without access to the bigger world when you have the internet, but you do need to provide actual economic opportunity in local communities. There's no reason why West Virginia has to be a doldrums or the only thing to do is mine there. They've got land, they've got very beautiful places. I've been to West Virginia, it's quite nice. There's no reason why it has to be considered somehow an embarrassment to live in compared to Pennsylvania or something. It's just a function of the fact that historically it hasn't had the level of industrial development that we need. And you see this with military investment. New Mexico gets a shit ton of military investment in certain towns to build nuclear weapons and things, and then they have nice communities built around that. So it's just a question of how much we're willing to invest in communities directly.
And gentleman in the back.
Yeah, I'm interested in the question of whether the worry about the coercive aspect that the lady was talking about in the panel of the job guarantee. One way to address this is to make a job guarantee something where the individual who wants a job negotiates what that job is going to be and brings their own ideas to the table rather than being told what the job is. Like a lot of this, what I'm hearing, I'm a little concerned also about what the gentleman just said about from the left party about undercutting union wages. I think it's a very valid concern. And you can think of how you could spin the system if you're a clever administrator to do exactly that. And people tend to do what's in the financial possibility. So if instead the deal was you came to the table, you're unemployed, you want to, or maybe you're not unemployed, you're working at Starbucks and hate your job, okay? And you want to do something meaningful with your life, and you go to the Arbeitsamt, to the job center, and you say, I have an idea for something I want to do, something meaningful I want to do. And if you can persuade the person at the job center to write a contract with you that has milestones and specifies what you're going to do, and maybe also has 4 other people who are also job center applicants in a co-responsibility situation like the microfinance kind of group of 5 people are co-responsible, maybe then what you're doing is transforming work really in a profound way and forcing Starbucks to compete on salary and benefits terms with people who are getting minimum wage to do what they really want to be doing. Right? So I just want to ask whether you think that might be a less coercive, a more libertarian, and also a better way to go, which is less likely to undercut union jobs.
Pavlina Chernová has written that exact proposal called a social entrepreneurship model of a job guarantee. It's available as a Levy working paper.
Thank you.
I hadn't heard of it, so good.
Any ladies in the audience who want to ask some questions?
I'll talk to you.
Yes, I have a question because it still concerns me quite a bit how this would be feasible within the context of the European Monetary Union. And I still struggle to think about how some countries would be able to do this basic employment. And I would maybe like to hear a little bit more on the constraints that you were mentioning, that you were saying that even within the current constraints, this would be possible. And I would like you to maybe expand a little bit more on this, please.
Yeah. What did you refer the question to?
To the person. Well, if someone else wants to.
Yeah, of course, I was mentioning the constraints are binding, and not only on the part of the nominal deficit GDP ratio, which we know is 3%, but also, which is worse, on the structural side, because the compliance with the European fiscal rules is a complex web of rules relating to the so-called output gap, which is supposed to be an estimate of the ratio between the potential and the actual GDP of an economy. So when this gap is shrinking, according to their estimation models, then the fiscal space also shrinks even below, and usually much below, the 3% deficit GDP ratio. But that's why we are forced to think about the reasons why this can happen or not. So ideally, this model wants to catch the productive potential. So productive potential can be formed by capital or labor, let's say. In terms of capital, it's investment. And if you raise investment, then you're supposed to increase the capital stock, and this opens up space. In terms of labor, it's labor force participation. So an income support program can stimulate labor force participation because it can draw in active workers from, and get them to the workforce. But a direct employment program can surely be expected to boost labor force participation. So this opens up a better space. We have simulated some impacts of an estimate of giving a base wage to all existing unemployed people, and of course this would mean to exceed the deficit GDP ratio in the first year. So the 3% threshold, but not by much. So it means that you would have to negotiate, and you would have, of course, to do it on first, and then be aware that you will be involved in a negotiation with the European institutions. But what we see as a pattern of growth in a very several subsequent years is that this is the kind of program targeting poverty and welfare and unemployment that actually has the highest growth potential. So besides all the political questions that this can raise, one might say, okay, I'm going to, I don't care about compliance with the rules, I just do it and let's see what happens, and this is a point. But if you want to justify a position, then among all the possible spectrum of programs, of income support programs, welfare programs, labor market policies, this is the one that actually gives you the highest, the greatest space for action. And also because it's transitional. I just added a point on this when we were talking about before, there is the concern that this might end up in the state controlling a greater stake of the economy. Well, this is a bottom-up program, so as Rohan was saying, Pavlina Cherneva has written on this, it can be a bottom-up program where non-profit institution can propose projects. And so this also, this also responds to concerns about the state getting a control over the economy, but it's not the state, it's actually, it can be made from the bottom up. Financially, this means in the first year, if we consider Italy, that this would more or less imply a stimulus of 3.5% of GDP. If we consider the savings that we have from existing income support programs to the unemployed, because this computation must also be made, because we spend something like 20 billion euros yearly for existing unemployment support programs. We save these resources, and then we can use them for funding this program. Of course, and I repeat it again, ideally we will not have constraints, and we will not be forced to deal with these constraints.
Fabio, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just very quick on the legal framework. I think that's a very valid point, because we have prohibition of monetary financing in the EU treaties by central banks. So central bank basically can loan money to banks, but not to the government. And that is an obstacle. There's no question here. I mean, there are ways to sidestep it. What Mario Draghi did when he said whatever it takes was basically to say, okay, we buy the bonds, from the investors, and that's also monetary financing, but it's not the way MMT wants it to be done, if I understand correctly. And so you could argue, like in a crisis, there are always ways to, circumvent the law, because European Union is anyway confronted with a huge crisis, and I think when shit hits the fan, they basically ignore the law, but certainly that is an obstacle. There would be ways around it. You could, for example, say, okay, European Investment Bank is issuing a bond and ECB would buy it. That would be perfectly legal because they can give money to a bank, the European Investment Bank, but it would be all a little bit technical. So I think we have to address the question of the EU framework, certainly on the debt rules, on the Stability and Growth Pact. I also agree that you would have a positive impact on GDP when you finance these investments, so you may even not end up in a situation that you have the problem of the debt rule. But certainly we would want to have a much more flexible framework, at least exempting public investment from the debt rules, or scrapping it all together and have something like there is an argument you need a fiscal coordination mechanism, because if you have a common currency, then the Italian government could have the idea, let's build a second Colosseum or something. Also, the economy is already fully, utilized with full employment. But I think it would be absurd from economic viewpoint. Why would they do that? Like if they don't even find a workforce to build the second Colosseum. But you could still argue you need a kind of rule, so not everybody is free riding, let's say, on the common currency and spending like there's no tomorrow, and then you would have like inflation picking up. But I think there are better rules than the current rules to do that. You could have expenditure rules that are linked to GDP and things like that. But you're perfectly right that there is a legal framework which is limiting that, and I would say more the prohibition of monetary financing than the current debt rules. And we would have to attack that point. But let's be clear. I don't think that the European Union and the monetary arrangement will survive anyway much more than 10-15 years if we continue down the road we're currently experiencing. So I think there will be hard questions to be asked anyway in the near future.
Thank you, Fabio. You just wanted to add, you wanted to say something?
No.
I just wanted to add one last sentence before we close the panel. So, money does matter. That's the motto of this conference, just not the way most policymakers think it does. We're hoping this will change, and we're glad to see Fabio here with us. And he said some very sensible, good things, I think. And an understanding of modern money really opens up a treasure trove of possibilities for a society to make use of its single biggest resource, which is its people. So this is why we're here, and thank you all for being here.